procedures. We will be recording the audio, video, and the chat content of this video conference meeting. You can control your personal video feed at any time. So you can just turn off the video and then turn it back on later if you want us to see you, or you can leave it on. We ask that you remain muted until you are invited to speak, and use the Zoom chat feature if you have questions or comments during Dr. Burke's presentation. Marielle Kolker and I will be monitoring the chat, and at the end of the presentation, we will take questions and answers either from the chat or by, if you raise your hand, then we'll call on you and ask you to unmute yourself. So we suggest speaker view for the best viewing of the presentation, or you can use the grid view if you want to see the other participants. Okay. So with that, we should start recording. Okay. So welcome everyone, and I'd like to introduce Couture Harris, who's our Public Policy Chair for AAUW, New Jersey, and she will be introducing tonight's speaker.
Yes, thank you, Karen. About a few months ago, I saw Dr. Burk, the Alice Paul Institute in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, had her, and her book is just wonderful. If you want a 101 course about politics and what's going on in our brains, please read it. It's an excellent book. It's a guide, and for the future also. So thank you again for joining AAUW New Jersey. This will be a very inspiring and educational moment for us. We're happy to welcome Dr. Burk. And just a quick note that Heidi Hartman from the Institute for Women's Policy Research, she said about Dr. Burke's books, is a well-written, accessible, and incisive guide to our political process and all the major political issues of the day, about taxes, war, military, education, the economy, healthcare, which is very dear to me, as well as the more traditional women's issues like reproductive rights, and that's for all of us too, and equal rights at work. So I have a few questions for Dr. Burk. Thank you, Dr. Burk, for out of your busy day coming here and speaking to the members of AAUW and non-members also. So my first question for you, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, lots of things. Obviously, the elections are important to women, but they're getting more and more important as we see how things are going this year. Every election is sort of the election of the century, but this one may really be. And this is the 4th edition of the book. The book started in 2008, and it's really, the more things change, the more they remain the same, in the sense that it is discouraging that many of our issues back in 2008 are the same as they are now. We still don't have equal pay, for example. We still don't have any child care, which we'll talk about in some detail in a few minutes. And we've made a lot of progress, but we're stuck in some things. And I realized that women are busy. They don't have time to watch TV all day and, OD on politics. And a lot of people nowadays, especially the younger ones coming up, are not really getting civics in high school or even college. They don't even know how the government works. So I thought if I could put all that together, who does what in the government, why it matters to you, and then go issue by issue. And as you mentioned from Dr. Hartman's comments, I cover a lot of issues. Some are more important to younger women, some to older women. So I like to say there's kind of something in there for everybody.
Thank you. And how did you prioritize the issues you write about?
Well, I didn't so much as prioritize them as to make sure everything I thought women are concerned about is in there. as I just said, if you're 23, I'm sure you care about reproductive rights more than you do Social Security. But if you're 73, you care more about preserving your Social Security. It's a higher on your priority list. So I tried to cover things very divergent. I have things on women in the military. I know a lot of women are concerned with how women around the world are doing. So I cover our foreign treaties and how the United States is treating other countries, helping or not helping. Some things that you don't ordinarily think of as a women's issue, but they are. And one example of that would be gun control, because gun violence is a big part of violence against women, and it's one of the major causes of death of younger women in the country. So it sort of goes from A to Z, so to speak. And I tell people in the first chapter, you don't have to read this book chapter by chapter. Skip around, find out what you care about, and read that.
Okay, thank you. The next question, why do you think women are even more motivated to vote this year?
Well, we have a lot to lose, and we have a lot to gain if things turn around. But women are seeing, just take the COVID thing right now. And I want to go into, in some detail, all the ways that the issues mesh together, and not for the best because of COVID. A lot of women have lost jobs. A lot of women in jobs that are essential are so stretched, they don't know what to do, when, and how. I read something the other day by a woman that said, I'm now a lunch lady, a child care provider, an office work, and a medical attendant. And I'm doing all that at home. And so I think that those are some of the kinds of things that are motivating women to get out and vote and try to make some change nationally, but in their own lives.
Okay. The next question, many women-owned businesses have been affected by COVID. What can be done to help them going forward?
Well, right now on Capitol Hill, as we speak, there are a couple of bailout bills similar to the first one that happened back in March. And that sent money to small business to keep their employees employed. It did some tax deferment, although that is controversial because they're going to owe those taxes later. But right now, the Congress is divided. The Senate is all Republican, mostly men, who want low taxes, and they don't want to put any more money in it right now. They have an offer. And then the House is headed by Democrats, and I might say a woman. Women have different priorities. Certainly Nancy Pelosi does. She wants more money. McConnell in the Senate wants less. What's happening? They're at a standoff. And these small businesses, to get right to your question, they can't survive right now without some help. They did get 4 months of help, but it's gone now, and can't keep the doors open. So, and women are increasingly the majority of small business owners. So it's having a gender effect that, of course, the women know it, but in general, when people think small business, they don't necessarily think women, but it is.
Okay, thank you there. The next question I have, the president has been criticizing his own appointees lately and calling them incompetent. Maybe he's looking himself in the mirror, but does it really matter who is appointed? In the end, doesn't the president make all decisions anyway? So there's two parts to the question.
Right. Well, I'll answer the second part first. This president is trying to make all the decisions, more so than most. And the best example of that is the conflict between him and his own health advisors. because he is making some decisions about what the public ought to know, what kind of process people ought to be going through to try to tamp down the COVID. So he's a little worse than most people about trying to make all the decisions. But to answer the first part of the question, it makes one heck of a difference who gets appointed. And I'll give you an example that directly affects women, younger women in this country, all the way from really junior high, all up through college. And that is Betsy Devos, I'm sorry to say, a female employee or appointee, who is head of the Department of Education. And she has weakened Title IX, which is our law that protects girls against discrimination in school, including sexual harassment and rape and assault. She's weakened that law with regulations that she has written. And nobody passed a law to do it. She did it as an appointee. So far, it's held up. So who's appointed and their own priorities make a huge difference.
The next question. Some of us are in districts where our members of Congress are already dedicated to women's rights, so they don't need convincing. What can we do in that case to move our agenda forward?
Well, I thank you for that question. I live in a district, I live in a state where our entire congressional delegation generally support women and things that will advance women. Now, having said that, they're busy. They don't have time to track every bill of benefit to women because they got everything else to deal with. So yes, we know they're on our side, but you know, my congressman is Ben Ray-Vaughn, who's in the House right now, but he's running for the Senate. And not too long ago, I learned that he had not signed on to, this was before the Paycheck Fairness Act passed, because it had slipped through the cracks. So it makes a difference to call and say, what about this? And the staff person said, oh my gosh, we didn't know that. I'll take care of it right away. But there's so many bills out there that they have to keep up with. If we just speak to them when we see them or send them an email or a note, they tabulate all that. And we may know about some things that are pending that are important to women that maybe they haven't had time to look for or attend to. So it's important to keep in touch with them, even if you know they are quote unquote on our side. They can't know everything all the time. And if we keep up with stuff that affects us directly, it helps them to let them know about it.
All right, our last one. What do you think is going to be the most crucial politically for women in the next 4 years?
Well, how about the next 4 weeks? The next 4 years, we could lose a lot, we could gain a lot. But right now on Capitol Hill, there are two things going on that are very crucial to women, and they're both tied up with the Supreme Court nominee who is testifying this week. And they expect to vote, I think, at least in committee, sometime before this week is over, and then go to a full Senate vote. And those two things are health care, which is going to be heard in the court on November 10th. Whichever judges are on the court on November 10th will be allowed to vote on what happens to the Affordable Care Act. And it's not going to be immediate because they hear a case and then they mull it over and so forth, and it might be several months before an opinion comes down. But I will talk a little more about what women have to lose, and it is one heck of a lot if the Affordable Care Act is overturned. The second thing is Roe v. Wade. There are no cases this minute pending before the court that would overturn Roe, but there are more than 20 trying to go through the lower courts to make their way up to the Supreme Court in the hopes by the right wing that Roe v. Wade will be overturned. And I don't have to tell this audience what that's going to mean. There are about 43 of the states have some kind of restriction that will immediately go into effect. In my own state of New Mexico, we have a 1969 law that's still on the books. It'll become the law if Roe is overturned, and it's exemplary. It'll basically outlaw abortion. So those two things in the next weeks and months, but in the next 4 years, I want us to think about what are our opportunities if we can prevail at the ballot box. And by prevail, I mean not only elect a president that cares about women's issues and truly cares, but elect members of Congress in both houses, because there's so many obstructionists in Congress, and I'll talk some about that too, that they put fiscal responsibility, as they call it, over responsibility for human progress, particularly women's progress. And some of them are ideologically absolutely opposed to women having their equal rights. So the next 4 years could make a huge difference both ways. If the Congress turns any more anti-woman, we're looking at some really rough riding. And the example I gave you of DeVos and the Department of Education is just one thing. There will be cuts to Medicaid. That's mostly women. We could lose the ACA. There are just so many things that won't happen if the right things don't happen at the ballot box. But we can talk about a number of things that we have to gain too if we elect the right people.
Okay. Basically, that's all the questions I have for now. I don't know if Marielle or Karen, are you accepting any questions?
Go ahead.
We haven't seen any in the chat yet.
Okay, well, let's just talk for a minute with the COVID-19.
Are you taking questions?
Oh, I hear someone.
I have a question.
Oh,
Are you taking questions?
sure.
Good evening. I have a lot of concerns about funds for COVID relief for single women. I'm afraid that if they don't have the money, they won't go to the doctor to get the treatments and the testing for COVID because they just won't be able to afford it. Who do you think should be hammered at the state or local level to really, really insist that something be done to make sure that people get funding, relief funding for COVID?
At the state and local level, is that the question?
Yes.
I think the states vary so much, it's going to be hard to answer that. The umbrella coverage, as we know right now for women, there are two. There's the Affordable Care Act, and for lower income women, there's Medicaid. And right now, both of those are covered in general. Medicare, of course, for older women is also there. But we have to have some specific legislation, and it really needs to be national, that says COVID testing is free, the treatments are covered by all insurance under an emergency order or emergency legislation. That could be done at the state level, maybe. Depends on the insurance regulation structure in each state, but the states don't have the money to do that. And the federal government could grant money, but again, I don't know how insurance is regulated state to state, particularly if the ACA goes away, it's going to be a free-for-all. Right now, they all have to go by the same rules. So if the feds if our Congress would do something quickly, then women could be covered. And as far as the states, there is one place, and that is Medicaid for the lower income women. Some of the states have put in pretty onerous restrictions on Medicaid. And that does vary state to state, and each people in each state need to check and see. Like in some cases, there's a requirement that you must be working or looking for work. People with disabilities, maybe they can't do that. Women with kids right now, there's no daycare. They can't look for work and they can't work. And they have to have some kind of coverage. So these kind of onerous, really punishing the poor regulations under Medicaid are a state issue. And you just have to lobby the governor and the state representatives and state senators.
Okay. Thank you.
I had a question. I saw in your book you had a lot of information about the effect of women's votes in past elections. And I was curious how you researched this information and chose which elections to look at. Is it something you've been following for a long time?
Yeah, actually, it's an interesting question, and thank you for it, because I do have some current data on that too. You know, when the vote was passed for women, and we know that white women got the vote in 1920, and other women came along. In my state, Native American women didn't get the vote till almost the 1950s, late 40s. So that varied by state. But what men said in opposing the vote at all levels was that they said two things. They said, well, women are just going to vote like their husbands anyway. That's assuming that all women have a husband. Or, and so it doesn't matter, their husbands can vote. Or they said, women will take over the country if we give them the vote. Well, good. But obviously, we haven't taken over the country, and women did not vote substantially different than men for many, many years. But in 1980, that changed, and there was, for the first time in history, a gender gap where women voted substantially different than men. And there were a couple of reasons for that. The ERA was pending before the Congress. That was one. Reagan was against it. He was running for president. And Roe v. Wade had just been decided about 7 years earlier. He was against that too. He ended up winning the election, but women did vote differently from men. And the gender gap has never, ever gone away. And what's relevant this year, and I just looked this up like an hour and a half ago because the numbers change weekly now. There are so many polls out. The gender gap is greater right now than it has ever been since 1980. And women are in favor of Joe Biden by 16 points over what men are. And so I am so fond of saying this, and if you don't go away with anything from this presentation today, except for 5 words, did you get that? 5, as in they say 5 in Texas, not 5, which is where I grew up. But anyway, I want you to remember these 5 words. Women can control any election. And we can, because we are the majority of the population now. We're the majority of registered voters, and we are the majority of people that actually show up at the polls. So it is in our hands. We can do it. We have to stop voting like Joe Blow down the street says we have to because corporations don't have enough money and they won't hire us and so forth. No, we've got to vote our own issues, vote our pocketbook, our heart, our health, all of that, our kids, and we got to turn out, which I don't have any doubt this year we will. We've already seen just since the polls have been open in a few states for a couple of days, 8-9 hour waits. And I think it was Michelle Obama that said in one of her speeches a while back, she said, bring your lunch, bring your cot if you have to, stand in that line because it is so important.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. We have a question here from Marion Wattenbarger. In the past 30 or 40 years, the government has been so demonized. Do you have suggestions for talking about the needs of women that require support from government funding with individuals or groups who automatically think everything to do with government is bad?
Yeah, I do. It's really interesting when you think about our history, because there was a time, let's take daycare. We don't have any real daycare. We got a little bit of Head Start. We have a little bit of pre-kindergarten, but we are the only industrialized country in the world that does not have some kind of government-sponsored child care, either daycare, pre-K, or after-school care. You look at Europe, you look at the advanced countries in Asia, we're way behind the curve on that. Why is that? Because people are calling daycare, subsidized daycare, as socialism. Same thing with healthcare. Okay, it is socialism, right? Well, there was a time when the public schools were considered socialist, when they were being debated. When Eleanor Roosevelt was a kid, public schools were not in existence. They were considered optional. And if you could afford to send your kid to school, you could, but they weren't compulsory. The government didn't pay for it. Now, I don't think there are too many people these days, there'll be a few, but not too many that'll say, well, public school is socialism, we shouldn't have it. And so it's a matter of changing the way we talk about government. And right now, many of the folks, and we know who they are, in very high places in the government are essentially anti-government. And they are convincing people that even what they do, the place they work, is rotten and should go away. And, it's certainly a contradiction, but that's what they're doing. And we have to have leaders that respect the government, respect what the government can do for citizens, and talk about it in that way. And we have to ask the questions, what if we didn't have it? Let's just ask that question. If we didn't have Medicaid, for example, if we didn't have Medicare, I dare say there would be beds lining the streets outside of hospitals because they couldn't get in because they didn't have the money. And so when you hear that something is socialized, that is just a way to say we don't want to spend government money on that. We want to give tax cuts to corporations and very wealthy people. Jeff Bezos makes $1 billion every 3 days. Enough said.
All right, you're absolutely right. Do we have, we have Karen Kaplan who has raised her hand. Go ahead, Karen, you can unmute now.
There you go. Hi, thank you. You mentioned before the gap, the gender gap, basically, in voting patterns, and I wonder if you also see a gap in ages in terms of how young women versus older women participate, and whether there's more that we should be doing to engage younger women in the process.
Yeah, I think there is a difference. I think in general, older women are more reliable voters. And I think, I'm sorry to say, that one of my granddaughters, a very young, she's old enough to vote, but not by a couple of years, just by a couple of years. And I'm talking to her and I'm saying, do you know that you could lose your health care, and in that you could use your birth control, lose your birth control? which is paid for under the ACA. And she said, no, really? She's not a political person. I often say that I don't blame young women in a way for not knowing all of the issues as we do. They have not lived certainly as long as I have and seen the changes up, down, and backwards, and some forward. But think about my granddaughter. All of her life, she's been able to play sports. All of her life, she's been able to get in science classes. When she goes to college, she can go to law school. She can go to medical school. There are no quotas keeping her out. That's been her whole life. You can't blame them for thinking things are pretty good. You know, I can get a job. They don't realize that pay gap. They may not hit it for another 5 or 6 years. They're hired in at the same as the guys, but then something happens along the way and they don't get promoted in the same numbers. Maybe they want to get married, they have a kid. Uh-oh. And here's where COVID has come in too, and I just have to say it's dominating our lives. But it does mesh into so many of the issues that affect women. Think about, okay, you're a 2-worker family. You have some children. There's no daycare. There's no school right now. Somebody's got to quit work. Who's that going to be? The person that makes the least money. Who's that going to be? Usually the woman. And it is just, so then the woman drops out. Maybe she can go back to work by, let's say, next June. She's lost 6-7 months that she will never catch up. Dr. Heidi Hartman was quoted at the first of this presentation, and she had started and headed the Institute for Women's Policy Research for many years. And she and another economist named Stephen Rose did a study, and I think I mentioned it in the book, but on what happens to a woman that drops out of the workforce for a year. She will never catch up in terms of pay and promotion if she takes off 1 year. And so those are the things that disturb older women and mid-level women because they've experienced them, but our younger women haven't. I think losing birth control, that really got my granddaughter's attention. So if we try to frame it in a way with younger women that is going to affect their life directly and quickly, I think we can get them to the polls. And I think they're starting to wake up now and see with all this anti-woman rhetoric. A lot of women, young and older, are trapped at home in domestic violence situations and there's no help right now. So those things are things that I think they care more about. And that's kind of how we have to frame it.
All right. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? This is all very fascinating. I would like to say that you're absolutely right. The leaving of the workforce is such a gendered issue. But there's also, there's also the fact that the pay gap is real, even if women don't leave the workforce. And not everybody understands that. Jackie McGinnis, we have, why don't you go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, good evening. So glad that you're able to talk with us today. My question to you is this. I mean, as we look at the fact that, yes, we do, you look at it, yeah, we could control the vote. You know what I mean? We could control the buying power. So then the question is, why don't we? What is it that that we can suggest to, and some of it you've already answered, whether it was education, whether we find whatever it is that gets the attention or raises the question of how to get this women's movement, because the women's movement, I think, has become so splintered because, I mean, you know, just even with race, with religion, with, you know what I mean? So many things that we still have to work on, you know what I mean? So I guess I would ask, you know, what would be the suggestion of how do we become more of a united front? I mean, yes, understanding that we are of different political views, different, you know, different religious, definitely race. I've seen it as a Black woman, and I would listen to my, okay, forgive me, my other white counterparts, and we would definitely not see eye to eye on some things. And so how do we bridge that gap to become more, I'm not going to say united, but I guess it really is, you know, more concerted effort. So
Well,
this is me.
that's a very good question. And I am fond of saying, I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican or something else, independent. You want what's best for you and your family.
Sure.
And you want what's best for your country and your immediate community and you in the community. And I think we are seeing, I hope, another reawakening to the issue of race and violence. And it's tough what we're going through, and particularly for you all who are women of color and your families are being attacked, your kids just for walking the wrong way down the street and this sort of thing. I think we do have to continue to raise awareness and speak up. When, as white women, we are so privileged and blind to, you know what, I tell people this, and I want to encourage every white woman that is in on this call to listen to this and say it. I will say to people, I won the lottery. And they go, oh, you did? What did you win? When did you win it? And I said, I won it the day I was born. I was born white. I was born bright. I was born in the United States, and I was born to a family that cared about me. And all of that compounded means I was way ahead the day I was born. And we have to make our white sisters understand this and to help pull up all the women that didn't win that lottery. And so, you know, there was, and there still is, but it's not a real party anymore, but a National Women's Party. And we have to fight the men in both of our parties sometime because they don't prioritize the same thing we do. So this comes to me, now I'm getting to, this is sort of evolving as I talk, but you know what? We need half the women in the Congress. And we need a healthy percentage of those to be women of color who understand their own issues much better than we can ever by reading a book or even marching in their behalf. And so 50% women in Congress is a great goal to have. I have just been honored to be asked to help with a project that's been going on since 1972 called the Women's Appointments Project. And it is about trying to influence the incoming administration and working with the White House Personnel Office and the personnel offices in all the cabinet departments to put forward qualified women for positions below elected at all levels of government. And one of our priorities in that project is to make sure that the names we put forward and try to recruit represent the diversity of this country and not just the better educated, Ivy League educated women who are white, privileged, and so forth. And that is a bedrock principle. And the more women we can get at all levels of government, elected, appointed, at the staff level, the better off we're going to be, and we will be more united. But the first thing we have to do is recognize each other, that we are all human and our lives are valuable regardless of color or income or level of education. And sometimes we just don't do that. And I just want to add one thing about getting women elected, and a good example. When the Affordable Care Act was being debated, for about 5 minutes, it had abortion coverage in it. Well, that got voted down. But the Republican women went against the men in their party and crossed the aisle to vote for that coverage. And the same, it didn't pass because there are more men in the Congress, but they also did it on birth control. So there are issues that all women care about, and I think that's where we have to unite women on the issues and wake people up to their own blindness, really, because all of us have it in some measure or another, and we have to be open to opening our eyes.
Thank you.
And Dr. Burke, you make a really good point. This is Marielle Kolker. You make a really good point about allies and that women need to be educated and voting, but we also could use to grow the allyship of the men in our lives, because they are also able to, they're also needed in the struggle for women's rights and for supporting women's causes. And so I always struggle with that, but I think in what I've read is addressing the men who have daughters and speaking to them about how, what would you like for your daughters? Thinking on that, what do you think is the future of the Equal Rights Amendment, which actually was passed by the 38th state? I think it was in 2019. And if we do have, I know that the House sent it over to the Senate, and it is just it's languishing in the Senate, and it will not be addressed as long as the Senate is is seated. Do you think?
Yes, and thank you for, thanks for asking that question, because I was just thinking about some bills that the House has already passed that have absolutely no chance in the current Senate. We got to get more women in the Senate. We got to get more progressives in the Senate, regardless of party. But the Equal Rights Amendment, the bill that has been passed by the House, is to remove the time limit. And it already passed the House. As we know, the time limit is not part of the amendment anyway. It's in the preamble. So it's questionable whether it's valid anyway, but if they can just pass a bill that says it's out of there in the next Congress, that will help. So, and the other issue is rescission, because there are 5 states that claim they have rescinded their ratification. Oh. But there's no constitutional provision for rescinding a ratification. But they're just saying they did it. It's like some people are saying, and I won't quote anybody's name, are saying, oh, the coronavirus is just going to go away naturally. Well, these states are just saying, oh, we rescinded our ratification. You can't do that constitutionally, but it is likely to get to the court, and who's sitting on that court is going to make one heck of a difference. So I don't know is the answer. I wish I did. We have passed that 38 state barrier, if you don't count the 5 that claim they're not going to play ball here. I think we'll eventually get it. It's such a simple concept now. Whereas in the 1970s, I just ran across this today, was Jerry Falwell, I think, said, if the ERA passed, women were going to leave their husbands, kill their children, and become lesbians. and, and the Equal Rights Amendment was going to do all that. And now I laugh about it and I say, well, there were some women that were saying, yeah, but actually, I think it will eventually pass. This is another young women's issue. They don't know. And when I tell them every right you have right now to an equal education, to be able to get in that medical school or law school and play sports and so forth, every bit of that is statutory. That means that a hostile Congress can wipe it out in the blink of an eye. And they don't get it because to them, the Equal Rights Amendment is something their grannies cared about. So it's an education process on our part, I think.
Thank you. I'd like to open up the floor to more questions. If anybody has anything that, that they would like to ask of Dr. Burk. And perhaps while people are thinking about their questions, I'd like to ask what's going on in Arizona right now? I know that there's a big fight for Senate right now.
There's a fight for the Senate. Mark Kelly is the candidate who is ahead. It's looking like the polls are looking good. It looks like he may win. We may turn over the Senate. And by the way, he has a female opponent, but in this case, I'm pulling for the guy. And that's another thing we need to pay attention to, I think, is that just because the candidate is a woman doesn't always mean she's going to stick up for other women. And we do have to be careful about that because not just any woman will do, but that's looking good. I think Iowa is another place where the race is going to be very tight. And that's a woman incumbent that has not been particularly woman friendly. And so I think that's right now, I think it's a toss up, but the Democrats are slightly ahead. So we'll see what happens. But if we could get 50% of the Congress that are female, I think, well, there'd be more restrooms in the Capitol for women, but more than that, it would just be better for women in general. There are always going to be outliers on both sides. There's some men that are very goodwill in the Congress, and they will always stick up for women, although their priorities may not be exactly the same. For example, women and men, just in the general population, both are pro-choice, but women prioritize it differently for very obvious reasons. And women and men are together on many issues, and they're apart on some for some real screwy reasons. And I know our time is getting close, but I have to give gun control as an example. You ask a guy about, well, what do you think about, restricting guns? And many of them, the first thing they think of is hunting. And there's still that cowboy mentality. Well, I don't know, might have to clean up Dodge someday. Got to have something to protect myself and my family. But women think about two things: getting raped at gunpoint or their kids getting shot at school. Mm-hmm. So there is a gender lens there on most issues, and the more women we have in Congress, in general, the better off we're going to be. I want to mention two other bills that have already passed the House that if the Senate turns over, I think have a good chance. One is the Paycheck Fairness Act. It's a pay equity bill. It doesn't do a huge amount, but it does do some things. We now know from research that one thing that holds women back is they start out with a pay gap. And then the next job that they get is based on their salary history at the last job. And so the pay gap follows you no matter how many increments you get, as long as it's based on prior salary history. So that's going to be outlawed if the Paycheck Fairness Act passes. The other one, very important to all women, but particularly women of color because they are such a big population, making the minimum wage. The minimum wage raise has already passed the House, but McConnell says, I'm not bringing that bill up in the Senate. And Trump says, go ahead and bring it up. If it passes, I'm going to veto it. So, and they're on record of that. So those are some bills that come next January, maybe things will change for women. And those are two important economic issues that will be before the Senate almost immediately, we hope.
Thank you. Thank you. This is so informative. Thank you so much. And we have these positive comments also saying so informative and educational. We have two questions and we are running close on time. So I'm going to ask Carol Cohen to unmute first.
Yeah,
and then we'll move to Marion Wattenberg.
Okay, just a comment, not really a question, but the way Ms. Burke said that we need to get white women on board with the racial issue. You need to get men on board with all of the issues that women want. And it just can't be passed with just women. So
that is right. That is absolutely right. And thank you for pointing that out. No, it can't be. Well, the vote can get more women in Congress, and we do have the power to do that.
Right.
But we still got a long way to go.
Right.
You know, and in both parties, but particularly, I think there are so few women in the House, the Republican Party in the House, they just don't have a critical mass, even in their own caucus. So yeah, we need, I have a little list of wishes, and one is that all of the law bodies, the Congresses, the state legislatures, everything would be 50% women. And I will have to say that on this appointments project that I mentioned earlier, they will be partnering with other entities like the good government entities that are also working on appointments. And the deal is to try to pressure them to adopt a principle that the people they put up for appointments will be 50% female.
well, I'm all with RBG, nine Supreme Court justices. That's my goal.
Oh yes, but as we can see from the hearings on the Hill as we speak, just being a girl isn't enough.
No, but still.
Oh, but still, I know.
Yeah, nice to see nine.
All right. Thank you, Carol. Thank you very much. We're going to go to Marion Wattenberger now.
Okay. First of all, on a very personal note, I just want to say I'm so thrilled that you grew up in Texas. So did I. And to hear what you're saying brings me great joy. So thank you. This is kind of a first causes question, but you mentioned at the start of your presentation or answering the questions about the lack of civics education. So people don't even understand how our government works, that judges get appointed, federal judges for a lifetime, that kind of thing. So do you have any suggestions on a very practical level? Is there any movement afoot or any way to encourage civics education?
Well, again, it's lobby the school districts, put the money there, because often courses like that are the first to get cut. I mean, my God, we've got to have football, right?
Right.
So it is a matter, and one of my kids played football against my better judgment, but anyway, it's a matter of money and will, and so many things do come down to that. But that would be one of those local levels and even state level that could be worked on, because there are local and state curricula, and we badly need it. The young people really need to know that their vote counts, what happens when they don't vote, and how the government works, because so many people do not know. And that's why I put a couple of chapters in my book about, you know, there's this, and this, and then you're almost there, but then there's a court and so forth.
Great. Could you remind us again the name of your book?
The name of the book is Your Voice, Your Vote, The
Right.
Savvy Woman's Guide to Politics, Power, and the Change We Need.
Thank you. Thanks
I
so
just
much.
have a question, maybe might be a little wrap-up question, that there's so many organizations working for women's rights. AAUW is one of many. And I was wondering if you had a feeling for which are stronger or in organizing the women and being effective. Are there different areas that different organizations are more effective in?
Yes, I do. And there's strong parallels here to the faction, shall we say, in party politics. I mean, right now we're hearing about so-and-so is really a socialist and he's not saying so, but the left wing of the party and the more moderates and this and that. But where I think the strength is in a diversified women's movement is that they can take on different issues. When I was in Washington, we had a National Council of Women's Organizations. It was a big coalition. And unfortunately, it met its demise of several years after I left, and one because I left, there were many reasons. But we had task forces that were chaired by the groups that were concerned with different issues. So obviously Planned Parenthood would chair a task force that was concerned with reproduction. AAUW would do maybe education and civic responsibility. Business and professional women took on the corporate discrimination. And I could, there were women's health groups. And we had a diverse coalition. We had a number of national groups that were concerned with African American, Hispanic women's progress. We had Asian groups in there that advocated for their cohort, which is certainly appropriate because most of our institutions, the white people are pretty well advocated for. They do need that. We need that. We need that diversity and that diversity of issues. And I would like to see another umbrella group come together because we were able, we would go to the Hill. One good example, and I know our time's almost out, but I'm getting a lot of stuff about Joe Biden and Anita Hill. And I was there for the hearings, as were several of the other women's groups leaders. And I have to say, we begged Biden at every break. We accosted him in the coffee shop. We nailed him whenever we could to let some more women testify, and he wouldn't do it because his priority was getting an African American on the court. And we were mad. We were very mad about that. But fast forward a few years, the Violence Against Women Act is before Congress. It was so much stronger for 5 of us to go in there and talk to Biden. And I will have to say by then he had changed because many times we got shoveled off to an intern or an aide to talk to us. No, Biden would sit down with us. And he would say, what do you think we can have in this bill that we can actually get passed? And what are we going to have to drop? And because we had that diversity in the room of women's groups and women themselves that worked on different issues, looked different from each other, cared about different things, we were able to build a better bill. And this is why I think that if we can get together again sometime sooner rather than later to do that kind of work together, we're all going to be better off. So thank you for that question.
Real quick, I know that our time is obviously coming to an end, but what I would like is if in the chat, because we have about 29 women or so, take away some others. If you can put one word that you can walk away with after listening to this discussion, if you can write that one word in the chat so that we can see how much this presentation and presentations like this how important it is to get us really start thinking in the more positive direction and the education and how we can reach our younger people. I'm a teacher, so you know what I mean? It's all about, you know, how do we get women to, you know, this next generation to take care of us and to make sure they keep moving forward. So everything that we did just doesn't get undone.
You know, this is interesting because I do host a radio show on public radio, and I asked a candidate this very question last week, a female candidate for the House, and I said, what's your last word? And she said, vote, vote, that's my last word. But I know everybody on this panel is gonna vote. So I'm gonna borrow a term from my long past, and it was something about an old car race, but it was called the push, pull, or drag race. So you could enter any kind of old car, and it was an obstacle course and so forth. So I think I would say, if you have to push them, pull them, or drag them, get people to the polls. That's the last word here. We gotta vote, we gotta elect the right people so we don't lose stuff, and more importantly, so we can make more gains for women.
Wonderful. I see some great words coming up: motivated, current, enlightened, fight, clarity, act.
Thank you.
Yeah, and those are wonderful things. And so I think that it's important that we all throw our words in there, definitely. Thank you so much.
Good. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Burk. Time is up. It's 8:06. We can go for hours talking about so many issues. Probably at 2 o'clock in the morning. At this, but thank you so much. We're grateful that you were here, spending time with us, and really educating us that we can do this. We just have to vote the right people in. No.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity. It's always a pleasure to talk to engaged women and energized women, and I can tell that that's what this group is.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to thank Karen Brown and Couture Harris once more for bringing us all together, and let's hope come January we will be celebrating victories for women.
You're here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for attending. Look forward to seeing you at our next event.
See you at the poll.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Burk.
Already voted.